Alright, so the goal in this video is to explore choices that we need to make when we're using colors to show categories or quantities or making Choropleth maps. So again, if you're using Choropleth symbology, this should really only be used if you're symbolizing data that are normalized for continuous variables, right? So things like percentages or normalization by population or by area. Okay, so I have this layer here for the kind of high plains portion of the U.S. So the black outlines represent the states, and then the interiors there are the counties. And for each county, I've summarized the percent forest cover from the National Land Cover data set. So that's a normalized variable, so it would make sense to symbolize that with a with a collar. Okay, so let's start this process. So to change symbology, we right-click on the layer in the contents, and then go to Symbology. That opens up the Symbology pane for that layer. By default, it's set to single symbol. We're going to change that to first Unclassified Colors. And when you're using Unclassified Colors, a couple options. So you can grab a field to symbolize. This is actually the percent forest cover. It picked that by default because that was the only field there. There's no other fields to choose from. If it weren't normalized, then you could normalize it. So for example, if you had area forest and total area, you could normalize by total area to get back a proportion. Okay, and then you can pick a collar ramp. There's a bunch built in, and most of these are pretty good. Since this is increasing in one direction, we would want to use a sequential color scheme as opposed to like diverging or unordered colors or something. And since we're dealing with forests, probably like a green ramp would make sense, and maybe something like that would look all right. If you're not sure what color ramps to use and you need some guidance, you can use some of the resources like the Color Brewer website, for example. Okay, you can also change the labels. So this is for the upper and lower label in the legend, and then you can see the distribution there of the values. Okay, so there's not a whole lot of options to consider when you're using unclassified colors. When you switch to a binned or classified method, so let's switch to that. That's with graduated colors. Then you have a couple more options. So again, you have to select a field, and it did the correct field by default. Again, in this case, we don't need to normalize because it's already normalized. The method here is the classification method. So by default, it uses this natural breaks method, which tries to look for gaps or breaks in the data distribution using an algorithm. Again, quantiles is going to place an equal number of map features in each bin, so in this case an equal number of counties. Equal interval is going to break up the data range equally, so there will be an equal range of values in each bin. Defined interval is you can actually set an interval size. So for example, if we set this to 10, that's just going to break it on every 10, which makes for a fairly clean legend. And then you can manually define them, and then just a couple other options. Geometric, standard deviation is looking at difference relative to like the mean, in this case, percent forest. Again, none of these are necessarily like the best. There's pros and cons for each. Just for this demonstration, I'm just going to leave it on natural breaks. And then you have to pick a number of categories. So a general rule of thumb is like 4 to 7 range. Again, you want to have enough categories that you're actually differentiating the values, but not so few, or not so many that it's actually hard to like tell the colors apart or actually interpret the map legend. So the default is 5. Again, you could change it. I'm just going to bump it up to 7, and you see it added a couple more bins there. And then lastly, you can pick a color scheme. So again, we could use maybe like a green type ramp, for example. Note that if you switch from the classes view to the histogram, you can see where the class breaks are and how that compares to the histogram or distribution of the data values. So for example, if we switch this to quantile, you can see it really clumps up the bins down here where there's just a lot of values or measurements. If you go to equal interval, you can see that they're equally spaced out, right? So again, we'll switch this back to natural breaks for now. And then in the class bin, you can change the class labels there. You can also change the symbol. So if you didn't want to use like a square, you could use like an irregular symbol. And it does it one by one. So you go through here and, obviously update all these and also make them different. Or you could have different symbols for each one if you wanted, which I don't think would be a good idea, but can do it. So you can see that change those over there. Okay, so that's that. I guess scales. Hey, you can set ranges and stuff. I don't really use that. All right, and then to finish up, let's look at using colors to show a category. So in this layer, I'm going to turn this one off now. I have just the state name. So let's say we just want to symbolize each county by the state name. It's kind of lame, but it's a simple example. So with that, we'd want to switch from graduated color to unique values. And then we want to pick our field. Oh, I'm in the wrong layer. I'm going to move up here. So we want to do this one, Symbology. So unique values. And then from that, we want to pick the state, and I'm just going to grab this. It's the FIPS code for the states. And you can see there it assigns a color to each state. Again, if you want to change the colors, you can just go in here to the color ramps, and there's a variety of unordered color ramps. In this case, you definitely want to use unordered because you don't want to imply an order. That looks all right. And then another thing with categories, you'll often get this all other values. That's just like a placeholder for anything that's not mapped to one of the colors. So that's going to show up in the legend by default. So if you wanted to get rid of that, which in this case there's nothing assigned to it because every county is assigned to one of the states, right? We'll just turn that off. So if you go under more here, turn that off. There's some other options. You can do like show count, so show you the number of map features that fall in each category. So in this case, it's going to be the number of counties in each of the states. You can show descriptions. You can change the order, all kinds of stuff. Again, if you're not sure what colors to use, there are resources. Again, you can use something like Color Brewer to decide on appropriate color breaks.